4 papers here. We want everyone to have plenty of time to present, and then hopefully a little bit of time to talk with you a little bit about their research. So I'm going to introduce the presenters as they come up, in case anybody comes in late, they still know who you are. Our first presenters, there's 2 authors to the paper, and one of the authors is with us today. I'm going to introduce both of them. I'm Lecklider, by the way. I'm just the chair of the session. Our first presenter here is Taihao, who is a PhD student in cultural anthropology at Northwestern University. Andrew Wortham, who is the co-author, is assistant professor of cultural anthropology at Duke Queensland University. So, thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Taihao, and today the title I changed a little bit, is between rumor and trust, rethinking intervention in a suburban cruising park in Eastern China. And introduce a little bit, and we 2 collaborate together. And I'm the graduate student. You already introduced that. Probably I just keep going. Okay, let me introduce the field site. Although our field site is in Kunshan, which is in China, I want to start the story from Shanghai. Many of you may not have heard of Kunshan. It is actually a control-level city in China. It is very close to Kunshan, but administratively, it belongs to another city, which is called Suzhou. Before 1978, Kunshan was just a very small rural area. It was not very visible at all. But after China's reform and opening up, everything changed. Because of its proximity to Shanghai, Kunshan began to grow. And as Shanghai became more urbanized and moved toward a service economy, many traditional industries were relocated to Kunshan. So this is how Kunshan started its urbanization process. Kunshan also has another important identity. It is one of the most important places for Taiwanese investment in mainland China. More than 70% of the top 10 Taiwanese manufacturing companies have factories here. And the city has thousands of Taiwanese-funded projects, especially in electronics and high-end manufacturing. Since the early 2000s, Shanghai's population has kept growing, and today it is more than 20 million residents. Living costs and housing prices keep rising. So many workers just choose to live in Kunshan and commute between Kunshan and Shanghai. Every day, more than 100,000 of people travel between these 2 cities. So in Kunshan today, we mainly see 3 groups of people. The first one is the largest one, the migrants from rural areas across China. And the second group is Taiwanese business people, although this group is decreasing because of the political tensions. And the third group is what we might call the overflow or spillover population from Shanghai, which is growing. I think probably this is the reason why I'm in here, like the rural and suburban core panel. And in Kunshan, there is a community-based organization. A CBO focuses on HIV prevention among MSM communities. It is called Mingde. This community is founded in 2014 and has built a long-term collaboration with the local CDC. And there is also a cruising park in Kunshan, which is called Cruising Park. I already anonymous all the locations. This park was discovered in 2023. At first, a local MSM individual found this place. It was very quiet, hidden, and had no street lights. He just invited several friends, come together and hang out. Slowly, it became a public space where MSM people from Kunshan and nearby cities come to relax, to chat, to pack, and have sex. People even gave the first person who found this place a nickname, the first park manager. So starting in the fall of 2024, Andrew and I began our fieldwork in CBO. Because my own research is about the interprovincial migrants, and Andrew is the visiting assistant professor in medical psychology in Kunshan, so we decided to collaborate. At that time, 2 key members of the CBO, Fei Yu and Da Huang, told us about this park and just invited us to visit. In their words, the CDC wanted to stage its tentacles into the cruising park. Because there is a large floating population, they believe that the risk of HIV is very high. And this park had already become at that time, it already had become very known. So the local CDC was already aware of it. We wanted to the park with a volunteer team. And sometimes we help to distribute some free materials. So however, something just unexpected happened during our third visit. That day, we arrived earlier than the other ones, like 10 minutes. We were holding the bright yellow bags just in the picture and standing there for 6 to 10 minutes. And that was when the rumor started. People in the park began to say that I look like a Chinese spy who didn't seem gay enough. And Andrew was described as someone from the US who came to poison people. This is a popular narrative in mainland China because COVID-19 was created by the US government. There is a narrative. So, and somehow that conspiracy story just got extended to us. In that night, even though it sounded ridiculous, many people were saying that don't use the condoms they too give to you. If you do, you might get HIV. And some people even say that you would take our materials for medical testing, and once the results come out, they probably would report us. And the next day, the CBO staff, Da Huang, heard about this and was very angry. He said that people in that park has no 素质, which is the low education, no personality, no manner. So don't expect them to share the same moral stand as us. However, for us as anthropology students and professors, the moment was actually the turning moment. It made us realize that the rumor was not just a background noise. It has some real effects on our research. And after this, we were no longer seen as the ordinary talkers. We were viewed connected with CDC or the US government. So this experience pushed us to take rumor seriously. And this is also the key argument of our working paper. Rumor plays a central role in the health intervention. It can be a form of resistance. It also reflects people's social worlds, like their precarity, what they care about and what they fear. So at this experience, we started to notice that rumors were actually everywhere in the park. They were not just about us. They were also about the CBOs, the police, and about the HIV itself. And the situation is that the CBO is actually positioned between the CDC's VRIC-driven governance and the ongoing refusal and resistance of park-based MSM communities. So our research question became that how do different forms of rumor shape and reshape trust between the CBO, MSM communities, and CDC? And before moving to the cases, let me introduce briefly about some background. Cruising park actually in China are not very new. Their emergence is connected to a longer history. In 1958, China established the hukou system, which divided people into rural and urban populations. This created a long urban-rural divide. And after 1978, with economic reform, many rural migrants moved into cities. And at the same time, public parks become more open than before. Walls are removed and access becomes much easier. This open, loosely regulated space created the conditions for cruising parks to emerge. So Heping Park is actually this kind of space. It is open with no walls, no gates, and people can move in and out freely. And there are some pieces I selected. And methodologically, we use participant observation and interviews. We spend time in the CBO office, in the park, and also follow some online discussion in WeChat groups. And we talk to some core members of the park, occasional visitors, and CBO staff. Most importantly, we trace how rumors move and how they start, how they spread, and what happens when they are challenged. And let me start. And for the main body of our, for the main body of the paper or the project, I selected 3 kinds of rumor. The first one is this rumor targets the CBO. One volunteer told us that many people in the park refused to go to the CBO for HIV testing. They did not want to leave their phone numbers because according to the CBO's policy, if you want to take a free test, you need to provide a phone number to receive a verification code. After that, you can get 15 RMB, which is about $7. But people in the park had very different interpretations. For example, Kohler, the second park manager, said that there is no such thing as free lunch. I've heard for a long time that they are working with CDC to take government money. And another person said that I heard they exposed people's HIV status. And someone else said that if you use those free testing kits, they can immediately see your result on the other side. Even though it's ridiculous, but people just believe it. And it is important here that people really say that I believe this rumor. Instead, they say I heard that. So rumor becomes a way to express concern without taking full responsibility. And in reality, the story is completely different. The CDC actually does have research projects that really rely on CBOs to collect some data. But this is not about stealing personal information. However, for people in the park, the process feels unclear and uncomfortable. So rumors emerge as a response to this uncertainty or not that transparent. And CBO also adjusted their strategy. They removed the requirement for the phone number. They stopped focusing only on distributing materials. They even brought go to karaoke into the park and trying to build some close relationships with MSM communities. So in this case, the rumor is not the opposite of trust. It works in between distrust and trust. People still rely on the CBO for some free resources, but at the same time, they use rumor to resist and protect themselves. And the second type of rumor is about the police. In the park, if somebody looks not gay or not gay enough or keeps distance from others, they may be suspected of being an undercover police officer. For example, Kola told us a story. A eccentric guy grabbed him and said that he had some connections with police and told everyone to behave legally. So Kola warned others to be careful. But later, the same person just came back and tried to hit him, accusing him of spreading rumors that he was a police officer. So we see how quickly rumors can escalate into conflict. And there are also rumors about police raids. One day on the WeChat group, which is an online platform, people were saying things like, the police arrest some people in the park, it is over for that place, they are cracking down. So these rumors actually spread very fast, even reaching gay communities in Shanghai. But what actually happened was much smaller. Two people, they had a conflict in the park, and that one is not dead. He just had some trouble with his sight. So one knocked off the other's glasses and they just called the police. So that's it. In reality, there is no target police intervention, but small events that get amplified into rumors, which create a constant feeling of surveillance. So people begin to regulate after these rumors of police, people begin to regulate their own behavior even without a real enforcement. And this is also reflects a longer history of gay marginalization and criminalization. So we interview some police. What their attitude is actually, you just do what you want to do. Just don't call the police and don't cause trouble. We are here just because this is our duty. If you call the police, if you don't call us, we can finish our patrol and go home. Everyone can mind their own business. And one police is very funny. He said that someone from your group called claiming he was straight and being harassed by gay men. He was pretending to be straight to extort you. I told him off. I said, you know this is a place for gay men. Why you come here to provoke them? So this is actually the police real attitude. They are just enforcing the order by Gadiel Fasan in this infographic. I think it's very similar. So for them, there is no target police intervention in the park. And in practices, police involvement is just limited and focused and enforcing public order rather than targeting their communities. And the third type of the rumor is about the HIV itself. These rumors often happen within the MSM community. Any small change in someone's body or behavior can become evidence of infection. For example, someone told me that, don't touch that guy in the jacket. He never wears short like t-shirt because his whole body is bleeding from HIV and syphilis. But in reality, that person was just sensitive to the cold and mosquitoes. These rumors can be very harmful because anyone can become the target, like the CBO staff, the park managers, or just regular visitors. But what surprised us is that when these rumors appear, people inside the community often step to challenge them. They may say that HIV status is prerogative, you should not spread that. You can't judge someone based on appearance. So rumor is not only about stigma. It also creates a space for health education themselves and anti-stigma work. And this was not taken by CBO or CDC, but for community itself. People argue that correct each other and share their knowledge. In doing so, they are actually helping to achieve the goal of health intervention. Because of the time limitation, I will come to the conclusion. Oh, sorry. There are actually three types of rumor relation we recorded, and there are several typical rumors. So just for a sentence, rumors may reflect the struggles, lengths, and fears of marginalized groups, such as concerns about health and privacy, sexual identity, discriminatory history, and distrust of the state. And rumors also can be weaponized as tools to navigate their precarious lives and uncertain futures. Lastly, what we want to further discuss is how the rumor gives chance to those low-class migrants to a chance to be heard, to gain visibility and pleasure in a world where they are otherwise ignored. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, next up, we have Gadiel Gongora, who is a MA student in Hispanic literature at Texas Tech University.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the organizers and facilitators of this wonderful conference, and of course to all of you who are here today for your attention. Okay, so with that, I would like to turn to the figure of Cristina Precarity. She's better known as La Veneno, poison in English. I don't know if some of you may already know her through the acclaimed television series Veneno, released in 2020. It was directed by Javier Calvo and Javier Ambrosi, also known as Los Javis. And it's the series is based on Cristina Ortiz's memoir, Vigo, Mi Puta Ni Santa, written in collaboration with Spanish journalist Valeria Vegas. Okay, so if Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera remain indispensable to any account of the struggle for LGBTQ rights in the United States, Cristina La Veneno Ortiz occupies a similarly crucial place in the Spanish context. However, she is a very mediatic figure in the LGBTQ community in Spain, and her public persona differs in important ways from more conventional forms of militant activism. Indeed, some would not even agree that she should be regarded as a role model. Yet her trajectory constitutes a singular mode of media visibility, one that marked a turning point in late 20th century Spain. Today, I want to argue that La Veneno emergence on Spanish television is fundamental to the history of trans visibility in Spain, and that recognizing her legacy acquires a cultural and academic revaluation that complements and enriches globalized narratives of queer and trans memory. She became visible to a mass audience not through political recognition or institutional protection, but through sensationalism. Her case reveals that trans visibility in popular culture and the media does not operate always in simple or empowering terms. It can both degrade and humanize. Cristina, from now on La Veneno, rise to prominence within a national context that will later make Spain one of the most progressive countries in Europe with regard to LGBTQ rights. The third country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage in 2005, and one of the first to allow the legal change of gender and name on official documents in 2007. though it was still under a regime of medical and juridical regulation that required, among other things, a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Fortunately, this has been revised, and in 2023, 2023, trans legal gender recognition no longer depends on the medical certification, thereby consolidating a model grounded more explicitly in self-determination. But I want to return now to Lavenet, because her public emergency precedes all of this and helps to understand the forms of trans visibility that were possible before this legal transformation took place. So Cristina Ortiz Rodriguez was born in 1964 in Adra, a small town in Andalusia, rural Spain, during the Franco dictatorship, which lasted almost 4 decades, from 1939 to 1975. Her early life unfolded within a deeply conservative and repressive social order shaped by authoritarianism, economic precarity, and rigid gender norms. In such a context, any deviation from normative masculinity or femininity was not merely stigmatized, but frequently met with open hostility, surveillance, and violence. I'm pretty sure most of you know the case of the poet Federico García Lorca, who was killed by the Francoist regime. So, as Ortiz herself recounted on multiple occasions, she was repeatedly subjected to verbal abuse and physical aggression in her hometown. From an early age, she was called maricón, a deeply derogatory Spanish slur, and was continually beaten. These experiences reveal the extent to which gender nonconformity was rendered socially intolerable within the rural patriarchal milieu in which she was raised. At the age of 15, she left Adra, marking the beginning of a process of displacement that would prove central to the making of her public and personal identity. She would later settle in Madrid, Spanish capital, where a new phase of her life began. If her childhood in Andalusia was defined by marginalization and violence, Madrid offered a different, though hardly uncomplicated horizon. It was the space in which she could begin to reinvent herself, even as the reinvention remained conditioned by poverty, social exclusion, and the limited avenues available to trans and gender nonconforming individuals in Spain at the time. It was there in Madrid that Cristina Ortiz gradually became La Veneno. And like many trans women of her generation, Cristina Ortiz was pushed into sex work by conditions of economic precarity and drastically curtailed her possibilities for survival in Madrid. She worked in Parque del Oeste, a space located near some of the capital's most affluent neighborhoods, where the visibility of sex work existed uniquely with the respectability of workers or frugal life. It was there in April 1996 that she first appeared on television in a report on the prostitution of those then misnamed travestis or cross-dressers. The broadcast marked La Veneno's first appearance on screen at the beginning of the public emergence of the controversial figure. Her spontaneity, extravagance, accent, which revealed her rural background, together with the visibility of a limited formal education, framed her as a stigmatized figure. At the same time, however, it also produced a kind of cultural shock. A poor trans woman transformed into a televisual spectacle through sensationalist media formats. Only 2 weeks later of that interview, she became a regular collaborator on the program. In these programs, aired during late-night adult broadcasting hours, La Veneno recounted with striking frankness, spontaneity, and almost excessive degree of detail her experience as a sex worker in Madrid Parque del Oeste, where a memorial plaque today marks her legacy. Although La Veneno was unmistakably instrumentalized by sensational television formats, her media presence nevertheless inserted trans existence into Spain's mediated cultural imagination at a particularly fraught historical juncture, when the nation was still negotiating in terms of its democratic, social, and cultural transition. This is not to suggest that trans people didn't exist in Spain by the time, but Cristina Ortiz Pavic's emergence compelled that presence, trans presence, into a new region of visibility, one that could no longer be so easily displaced or ignored. In all her contradictions, excesses, and vulnerabilities, La Veneno disrupted the dominant logic through which trans women had so often been cast as figures of danger or defiance. But her image made legible instead was the inverse reality, not that trans women are dangerous, but the world is profoundly dangerous for trans women. Her public persona rendered visible that precarity, ridicule, and violence that structure trans existence, even if such visibility remained deeply ambivalent. Cristina Ortiz opened a space of cultural intelligibility of trans womanhood, yet she did so through sensationalist media forms that depend precisely on the repeated public consumption of her difference. Cristina never ceased to engage in sex work during her years as a television collaborator, precisely because she understood the fragility of her own social position. This detail matters because it interrupts any easy narrative of upward mobility or emancipatory visibility. Television did not rescue her from poverty. It merely reconfirmed the terms under which that precarity could be seen, consumed, and discussed. Across her many media appearances, she was ridiculed, fetishized, and subjected to endless forms of invasive scrutiny, becoming the object of anxieties that, as many recognize, continue to shape public discourse about trans lives even today. Has she undergone surgery? What has she been for before? Her visibility then was never simply empowering and nothing of the sort. It was structured by voyeurism and sensationalism, sustained by a cultural logic that compelled trans women to explain, expose, and justify themselves before the public gaze. This tension was accompanied by a process through which television itself humanized La Veneno. This humanization didn't emerge deliberately, but from the public display of her private life. Her mother, who even refused to address her daughter with suitable pronouns, was brought onto the program on two separate occasions during which the host, Pepe Navarro, asked her parents whether they accepted Cristina as their daughter and invited them to speak publicly about the relationship with her. I want to argue that at this moment in the program, it produces what Keegan and Halberstam terms a prosthetic transgender gaze, one that aims to move the viewer into a sympathetic diasporic experience, effected through a visual rhetoric of transgender patterns and sympathetic audience identification. So the audience is not asked to understand Cristina through political analysis, nor through any structural explanation of trans marginalization. Instead, viewers are drawn into her world affectively. So they build a relationship with her every week. And Cristina suffering into her very condition is inviting the audience to feel her pain. The audience encounters, perhaps for the first time, a Cristina who ceases to be merely La Veneno and appears instead as a vulnerable and wounded figure. The viewers, without fully realizing it, have been building this symbolic relationship. It is a form of identification grounded in suffering, one through which La Veneno becomes humanized, as Cristina Ortiz Rodriguez. This becomes particularly legible in the series Veneno, where in the span of only a few seconds, the juxtaposition of a close-up and an overhead shot conveys the shock and pain that surface when those working on the television set discovered that Cristina had been physically abused by her mother, followed by applause when Cristina reaffirms both her identity and her chosen name. The scene is formally significant because it dramatizes the collective emotional reorientation of the room. The studio workers and audience are no longer positioned merely as consumers of a spectacle, but as witnesses to injury. In the end, La Veneno's trajectory does not offer a redemptive narrative liberation, or still less one spiritual activism. What it reveals is that her figure was crucial in making transness culturally unavoidable in Spain. She is a central paradox of media visibility. It can reproduce violence even as it generates new forms of affective recognition, as she was not simply seen but consumed, spectacularized, and at decisive moments, painfully humanized. It is in this volatile space that her historical force resides. Her story reminds us that visibility may grant recognition, but it never guarantees safety. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And next up, we have Ali Krueger-Kischak. Oh, I'm sorry, who is a researcher from Wilmot Township in Ontario.
Okay, hi folks. I wanted to start out by saying a massive thank you to the conference organizers, my fellow panelists, and the labor that's gone into keeping this room clean, keeping us fed, and running this conference smoothly. This is my first time in New York City, and it's kind of spinning my head around to be giving this presentation about cornfields in a place where I can't even see the sky. So I want to begin by situating us elsewhere. I'm from Wilmot, a tiny rural township in the middle of the Canadian province of Ontario's little dip underneath the rest of the American border. The flowers and weeds of my hometown are just the same as you'll find them 30 to 40 minutes beside us. Wilmot, situated on broken and unresolved Alderman Tract territory, is the traditional home of the Chinookan, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. And today it faces pollution beyond any meaningful point of air. The province of Ontario's last 40 years of conservative leadership have allowed 7 gravel pits to form a ring around the town. And most recently, 8 of my neighbors were expropriated off of the land that their families had worked for generations to clear room for an AI data plant orchestrated and backed by American capital. All of this is happening as a rural opioid and suicide epidemic has become endemic to rural towns across North America. And despite it all, we keep bringing each other casseroles for dinner, we keep sitting around bonfires together, and we keep showing each other the life-affirming and life-sustaining care, mutual aid, and working-class solidarity that made me into the leftist type today. Every rural town is the same but different, of course. By virtue of late-stage capitalism, many rural spaces would follow the same route, and many small towns sprung up at the early 20th century's post-industrial boom, sent to the mine or the mill or the factory that closed in 2008. What's left behind is oftentimes a literal gaping hole in the middle of our towns, and not just in an economic sense. Over time, these spaces accumulate meaning, becoming social, cultural, and symbolic anchors, shaping how we narrate our lives. The essayist Rain Fisher-Kwan, a fellow 20-something who spent her childhood in southern Ontario, writes of drives in this same region as defined by absence. Acres of empty farmland, dead or dying, an occasional horse with no stable brushing off flies, abandoned barns, their rotted roofs slumping to them like bed sheets. End quote. These bed sheets turn into ghosts eventually as we tell stories again and again in that distinctly rural, drawn-out, cyclical way about what once was and what could have been. Affect theorists like Mark Fisher, working on the feeling of eeriness, suggest that it's formed from absence, conjured either when there is something present where there should be nothing, or there is nothing present where there should be something. In these rural areas, we are in a constant state of discerning reasons for the emptiness, crumbling, and abandon that we see in our communities, which is always also a discerning of reasons for the emptiness, crumbling, and abandon that we see within ourselves. So often, what we are really circling is the quiet, unspoken fear of coming home empty, of returning to places that can no longer hold what we thought they would. Explanations offered for this range from specific local incidents to reified and unpinnable critiques of neoliberalized capitalism, to the blights of local to federal administrations, to rhetoric of the moral failings of rural folks, to derogatory dismissals of the hick, always dirty, backwards, and stupid, always thinly veiled classism under the guise of being an upstanding progressive. Through this visceral and unavoidable decay, loss, and abandon, we find ourselves narrating each other through it. At its core, this is all a form of grief. What interests me is not just that rural life is haunted, that's easy, but what rurality does with that haunting. It produces this pessimism that so easily dips into nihilism, which if we've all read our Adorno, we know is the easy slip into fascism. When abandonment is only ever narrated as loss, it creates a vacuum that can be filled in really vile and dangerous ways. So the question becomes, how else can we relate to this grief? My argument is straightforward. Trans studies offers a framework for relating to loss that is largely absent from dominant rural discourse. Trans studies as a field has been working on this problem, albeit in slightly different formats, for quite some time. And I believe that there's a lot of crossover here that can be helpful to explore. I think what's relevant here is particularly trans-expansive scholarship from those like Lecklider, who have developed a robust body of work engaging precisely with the relationship between grief, temporality, and transformation. If being trans teaches us anything, it's that living between what was and what could be is not only survivable, but generative. We become very familiar with what it means to live in relation to ghosts, past selves, future selves, and after selves. But these hauntings do not end in paralysis. Rather, their grief becomes an usher for beautiful possibility. It is an ongoing haunting, yes, but one crucially oriented towards material flesh and bones transformation. To be clear, my argument is not simply allegorical. I'm specifically proposing that trans studies offers a transferable discursive methodology around narrating and inhabiting loss, one that can be productively applied to rural contexts in order to disrupt entrenched narratives of time. Following on Gadiel's work on queer and trans divides, and Shirley Branson and Kyra Ayala's work on quote-unquote revolutionary transness, this is not an argument for some grand transcendence or exploding all the binaries. This is an argument for wanting the tangible goal of coming home. Being in those rural networks of mutual aid and rural anarchist underbelly culture and seeing what that does for us. And I'll also note this is all really close to Jay Prosser's writing on transitionism. I think there's something interesting and important about a rural trans politic that doesn't take itself to the courthouses or government offices or JP Morgan photo shoots, because none of those can be found in the middle of cornfields. You can't really have a neoliberal trans co-op if the nearest police station is 45 minutes away, but you're always going to have a trans kid in that small. What I want to suggest then is that trans studies offers us not just a set of metaphors, but a method for narrating and inhabiting loss differently. Trans studies scholarship has been very clear that grief is not simply something to be resolved or explained away. It is something to be worked through collectively and materially through practices of care and kinship. It is explicitly anti-nihilistic. This is where I find those working on trans utopias, writers again like you like there, and hey, Alison Hammer, I was geeking out at that. And other trans folks building off of Munoz's writing, particularly useful. To insist that transness is always oriented towards the not yet, and I'm also thinking about Andrea Long-Chu's metaphor of trans as a plane that we never get to onboard. To insist that transness is oriented towards a horizon that is not fully here, but still structures how we move to the present. Hope in this framework is not naive, but a disciplined collective practice. At the same time, I'm also thinking of Gordon's work on haunting, which reminds us that ghosts are not just aesthetic or metaphorical or social. They are what lingers when systems fail to account for violence and dispossession, and crucially, they demand something from us, asking us to respond. Trans studies takes up that demand in a very particular way. As the monster lovers that formed our discipline have written, trans existence itself can be understood as a kind of embodied haunting, a living negotiation between what was, what is, and be. But importantly, this negotiation does not end in paralysis. Instead, it produces movement, change, and notably transition. And this is the distinction that I want to hold on to. Rural discourse often seeks to stabilize meaning, asking questions of why did this happen and who is to blame. In doing so, they shift the question from what has been trans studies instead tolerates instability differently, allowing contradiction to remain open, and in doing so, they shift the question from what has been taken from us to what can be made from here. So when I would say that I want to bring trans studies into conversation with rural abandonment, what I'm really asking is what would it mean for rural communities to transition? Not away from themselves, but through what they have lost. The irony of these field crossovers does not escape me. Trans subjects and Hicks are supposed arch enemies in many stories today. But I believe that looking at these similarities in the questions is integral to building a more nuanced class consciousness, where queers and Hicks can see each other as both affected by and reflected in the same processes, in unruly alliance to steal chaos and Cameron's commentaries. And I don't know if there was anyone else here in the Care Not Cops panel, but there was a really excellent line by Rachel Joy Bell earlier, where she was talking about coalition work in Florida, saying, we don't need to get dinner together after, but we can still get it done. And I think that's so relevant here. As a queer trans Hick from Southern Ontario, who negotiates these dual identities regularly, I see this as a really exciting, important area full of opportunity and work to be done. This serves both fields. It gets rural studies away from nihilistic pessimism that opened the back door to fascistic rhetoric and alt-right politics. And it also gets trans studies more grounded in place and space, which I hope is a way to get us to look past our glaring issue of metronormativity that breaks crucial class bonds and normalizes the displacement of so many rural queer and trans groups. Theoretically, there's huge under-researched potential that I'm pointing out here, but I think this is also something that's deeply embodied. Everything that I write ends up being about rural trans kids. And I find myself again and again asking for a future where they are allowed to stay in their hometowns, where we don't have to kill that part of ourselves that loves those farm fields in order to be trans. I think so much these days about what rural trans kids in the States are feeling here. Outside of grad school, I work on Ontario's queer and trans youth crisis line. And I hear from kids oftentimes in hometowns just like mine, having worse and worse times. Typically these days, I can't offer them much more than encouragement. I think about these rural trans kids all the time, at home, in the Yukon, in Alabama, in Northern Nevada, in Eastern China, or the great rural margins of Spain like Africa. And I see how their fates are so twisted up in mine, and how my fate is twisted up in all of the other queer and trans folks ties to the world. I ask that you too think about them in a way that honors their homes, prairie sunsets they love so much, the fields and the gravel roads that they are being forced to leave right now, that we are allowed to want for a world where they can stay. This utopia is not superfluous in this time of crisis, it is critical. It guards us against the normalization of the violence that we are witnessing and experiencing, and it allows us to judge the distance between our reality and the ones that we hope towards. So I'll leave us off on the following question. If queer and trans utopias are always oriented towards the not yet, towards a horizon that is not fully here, but still structures how we move through the present, what would it mean to think about that not as something distant, but as the gravel road driving back to our hometown? That's all. Thank you.
Good.
You.
Okay, our final speaker today is Steve McCombs, who is a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Hello, everybody. I wanted to first start off. I wanted to first start off by thanking Flags and my fellow panelists. That was, I could gush up here for 15 minutes, but I'm going to Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be telling you a story about two guys. Their names are Fred Schoonmaker and Alfred Parkinson. Fred is the one on the left, and that's Fred. That's Alfred. We're going to start off by getting more into Fred, which is the one on the right, because as I'll get to later, he's the only one with sources about it, and that's a problem. Fred moved to the West Coast in the 1960s after his two best friends in West Virginia took their own lives instead of conforming to straightness. On the West Coast in LA, Fred linked up with the LA Gay Liberation Front in their 1970s project to move 479 gay people into Northern California's tiny Alpine County, which is 10 miles south of. After the stunt, Fred moved to San Francisco, where he continued to frequent gay intentional communities and live communally. He would go back and forth between Reno and the Bay, which are only about 3 hours apart from each other, in this period to experience nature and save some money. He met Alfred sometime in 1974, and 4 years later, as you do when you're in love, they opened up a 24-hour ice cream shop. If anyone's familiar with the area, on Church Street in Fulton. It was called Munchies, as you can see in the photos. Unfortunately, in a story that's as old as the enclosure of the Commons itself, in 1982, after about 4 years, the landlord doubled the rent and both of them were out. Luckily, Fred knew who it was. And the two, in 1983, headed to Reno. And this is where our story truly begins. All right, well, the two hated Reno. They hated Reno because Alfred hated Reno. Because Reno was and still is more racist and homophobic than San Francisco. So instead of quietly slipping into their community, they had a utopian dream of starting an all-gay commune in rural northern Nevada. However, after what sounded like a beautiful dream, after meeting and becoming acculturated by Reno queers, quickly turned into a land development project with a resort and casino and brothel. This is Nevada, after all. This is a place where prostitution and gambling were legal or are still legal in rural counties. If anywhere, it could happen in libertarian Nevada, so they thought. First, though, to fundraise for their plan, to get their plan into motion, in 1984, they began printing a newspaper called Daylight, this one on the right there. And this would promote their new capitalist venture. And this is where we get key insights into the kind of ideology behind Stonewall Park. So the first theme I want to point out is economics and migration. First theme that they wrote about. As you can see here, it says there Stonewall Park will be a secluded residential community, draw vacationers from across the country as well as close metropolitan areas in California, and it'll provide a financial base for the betterment of lesbians and gay social condition in general. In these clippings, we can see Fred make arguments about appealing to the economic marginalization of queer people in the 1980s. We know that this year is characterized by the dual conflicting trends of emerging gay consumer power in urban centers and simultaneously catastrophic economic ruin brought on by the AIDS crisis, which included employment discrimination and lack of legal protections. Clearly here, Fred is speaking to both of those things. There's also, for white gay men migrating in Nevada, we can look to Peter Bogue, who conceptualized in urban migrations in the American West. He explains the return to nature migration of Western gay men out of major metropolitan areas into rural areas from the late 1970s to the 2000s. Bogue outlined how men fearing HIV/AIDS were spiritually destitute and or economically destitute, fled areas like Los Angeles and San Francisco for smaller Western towns like Salt Lake City and Portland, and I'd argue or Northern Nevada in general. So we have an influx of people headed away from the city, and we have emerging gay consumer power becoming a market. Fred clearly was both influenced by and aware of these trends, right? The next thing I wanted to talk about gets a little bit more nefarious. So Fred, here we can see, as you can see the title, Civil Rights, New Areas Opened. On your left, as I'm going to get into, he talks about, equating the land development project to civil rights in general. And then, sorry, on the right, on the left, I don't know why I'm having trouble with that. On the left, you can see his unfortunate conception of civil rights. I'm going to read that real quickly. It is no longer proper for the general population to blame their woes on Black, Hispanics, or Jews. Society has progressed somewhat through the color, national origin, and religious phase of their prejudices. However, gays and lesbians are still fair game. This is a extremely controversial thing to say, especially for someone with a Black gay. Here we can see Fred evoking civil rights. More importantly, we can see how he used the language of civil rights to forward the settler colonial land development project. As I mentioned earlier, Fred was involved in the GLF's 1970s project to move 479 gay people into northern Nevada's tiny Alpine County, which was also a settler colonial project. When we center settler colonialism in the discussion, Fred's argument is really not that different than GLF's attempt to create a, quote, geographical power base for gay identified people, even if they are draped in revolutionary language. And I can tell you that the Washoe people that live in, or whose historic homelands are in Lake Tahoe, do not see a necessarily a distinction between gay settlers and straight settlers. In case you're wondering, the presence of Alfred does not really complicate the issue, because Stonewall Park was horrible to Alfred and all the members of the team. They managed to keep none of his papers. This is I'm revisiting why we're focusing on Fred in this. They managed to keep none of his papers, so he cannot unfortunately speak for himself. But the photos, as we will see that he's in, he is marginalized. As a member of the team, it was speculated that he was, quote, mentally disabled, and Fred only kept him around because he was strong and protective. And I'll contextualize all this trauma. The next theme I want to get into is home. As you can see here, I want to start to we hope to have some private time together. This is Fred speaking of him and Albert. We hope to have some time together in Stonewall Park, time that we can freely spend holding hands, watching sunsets, and simply enjoying the love each of us has for one another. We will not be able to do it alone. We will need your help. So we can see a couple things going on now here, and I'll explain that briefly. Stephen Bider, in The Queerness of Home, argues that home has been privileged in American life as a central site of intimate affiliation, a protected sphere where romance, marriage, and the family were imagined to find their deepest expression. And conversely, Katie Botza, in her new book, AIDS in the Heartland, argues that home is less about a physical domestic space and more about belonging. She goes on to say that home is fleeting, imagined, and negotiated with a broader, quote, white heartland narrative. She's talking about I argue that Stonewall Park exists somewhere between both of their conceptions of home. Fred and Al clearly understood the importance of home in Bider's sense of a domestic base, but they also negotiated that vision with Nevada's libertarian cultural construction, which is how their commune idea was transformed into a resort and casino in the first place. All right, I'm going to elaborate more on this conception, especially on Katie Botza's AIDS in the Heartland. So what is the white heartland equivalent in Nevada culture? I called it libertarian, live and let live as long as there's money to be made attitude, but it's a bit more nuanced than that, actually. It's a kind of libertarianism. Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes this phenomenon as, well, people in parties who gain state power by denouncing state power, specifically by increasing reliance on prisons and jails while eradicating social welfare. Nevada has a reputation for libertarianism. But I argue, and we'll see, as I'll hopefully show you, that politics in Nevada changed during the height of HIV/AIDS to allow these quote unquote libertarian politicians in these ruralities to kick, under the guise of public health, to kick potential revenue out of their ruralities, which is not very libertarian. So to get to the actual meat and potatoes of the story itself, I'm going to take you first. We're going to talk about Silver Springs, Nevada. So in 1985, Gay Life, which was the magazine I talked about earlier, ceased publication so that Fred could focus on this land development project. In 1986, Fred decided to pursue Silver Springs, Nevada. And these are unfortunate. These are the only pictures I could find of Silver Springs, Nevada. That's a contemporary Google Maps photo. So they sent out just shy of 20,000 brochures and received response from people all over the United States and Canada for this land development project, right? To illustrate the point about Nevada abandoning the veneer of libertarianism, in 1986 issue, the Reno Gazette, Jamie Hansen, a prominent political voice in Nevada, spewed, "I can't believe under these circumstances with regards to AIDS, with his regards to AIDS, that someone is trying to bring this into our community. We're not just concerned about AIDS, but bringing the homosexual pro-death style to Silver Springs would be a blight on our community." And when Lyon County, just the county this is in, Planning Commission met to consider Stonewall Park, they and Stonewall Park crew were absolutely sure that they would pass this resolution under the guise of their libertarianism. And unfortunately, Lyon County Planning Commission rejected their application, further proving the point about and rejecting their potential residents. The next place that Fred and Al tried to settle was the old shell of a former mining town. This new iteration of extractive industry would be in Rhyolite, Nevada. Fred hoped to build 75 cabins for the first, and he used this word, this is quote, pioneer residents at the end of 1986. National publications picked up the story as an oddity. Fred had no energy to receive the press because his symptoms of what would later you would find out would be HIV kept him in bed in the abandoned train car that you see there. And just to contextualize the picture on top of the picture, right? I took that's contemporary. They have a look see this on the bottom. That's excuse me. Fred and Albert were banking on a caravan of people from all across the country in California coming to the coronation ceremony on November 2nd, 1986. Only about 30 people showed up. And yet another example of Nevada libertarianism. In an article from the San Francisco Chronicle, Bob Revert, a state legislator, spewed, "A bunch of damn queers want to build a town of their own. And I don't like it one bit." Gail Spriggs, Republican Assemblywoman, and controlled but equally hateful scores said, "I'm totally opposed to the idea and will do something to block it in the legislature. The county cannot stop this undesirable business." That doesn't sound very libertarian to me. The first down payment, unfortunately, the first down payment that Fred and Albert were supposed to come up with in December was $365,000 for this property that cost over $2 million. And unfortunately, at the time when December came, they only had about $100 in the bank account. So they were kicked off the property. So in mid-December 1986, Fred jumped on a new opportunity to establish Stonewall Park, this time in northern Nevada's most depressed and rural area. It's called Thunder Mountain in the city of Imlay in Pershing County. And again, you see how the loudest rural representatives display a lack of adherence to Nevada's cultural reputation. Fred, meanwhile, laid a plan to sell memberships. Fred, at this point, was officially diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, and in May 1987, just a couple months after that diagnosis, Fred died. A month later, Reno celebrated its first Pride Festival on June 20th, 1987, and wrote a letter specifically inviting Fred, which shows the attachment. So I want to get into the fact that my argument that it's no coincidence that the Settler Colonial Project died with Fred at the base of Thunder Mountain. That's Thunder Mountain, and I got to get through this really quickly, is a monument dedicated to Native people in Northern Nevada, to the Northern Paiute, the Western Shoshone, and the Washington people. And it's illustrative that when you are doing a particular type of activism, it's not grounded in a critique of settler colonialism or with Black liberation in Nevada historically, that it will fail. And that's what that's unfortunate. So real quickly, in conclusion, actually the conclusion's here, and I'm out of time. But thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you to all for our host here. We do have about 10 minutes here to have some discussion and conversation about all this work. So I'm happy to open the floor to.
I have a question for Harry. So I really like your seeing a rural grief through trans studies, and I was wondering sorry, I need to read the actual question. So I'm wondering how it connects with conversations about settler colonialism and like in trans studies, how people in these communities work through the grief of the loss of the town that once was, but also through its root in settler colonialism.
If I project, can everyone hear me? Yes? No? Okay, I can get up to the mic. Hello? No?
I was gonna say, I don't think this is working either.
I can be so loud, maybe? Yeah? No? Okay, perfect.
We're talking, I'll just.
Okay, so I'll give you my answer from a Canadian perspective, which I understand. Thank you so much. I'll give my answer from a Canadian perspective, which I understand is different from an American perspective. And I've noticed that throughout this conference that there's really an absence in considering Indigenous folks. And so my town is pretty close to the it's a specific Indigenous reservation, and they've been doing some really cool activism work with Land Back Lane. And speaking from my experience as someone that is from a white settler town where we saw more Confederate flags than Canadian flags, there's definitely a really concerning fascist politic that's there. But there's also so much important rural solidarity work between rural working class folks and the Indigenous reservations that surround us, that were there before us, that are still there. And I see that there's a one-on-one relationality that folks have between these towns and between the reservation and the towns that surround that I don't necessarily see happening in the city. So when we're talking about real deal land back shit, those one-on-one relationships are how that happens, and that's what's going on in some of these rural spaces in really, really one-on-one individual ways. And these problems are being worked through together in really messed up and gritty and gnarly ways. But I think that that's what that process looks like at the end of the day. And that's how that's happening. Maybe that's a coherent answer. I don't know.
No, it definitely is. And I think it's just, it's a lot of food for thought about how rooted settler colonialism is in place and space, when we can detach from the borders on a map and we really talk about land and community relations and the way that different the way that trees have worked historically can form really interesting communal relationships between groups who you wouldn't think would get along, or would, for example, from my experience, somebody who wasn't born and raised in New York, but then moved here from a more a space, and moved here from North Dakota. New York is quite progressive, but a lot of people have never interacted with a Native person or a Native person's, a Native person in North America, not to erase indigeneity in other forms. But yeah, I appreciate that answer. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I'll ask a question.
see. I'm so interested, like this, like sort of commercialized gay campsites and like lesbian rural spaces, and then there's like the commune function, and I'm just like wondering if you say maybe a little, I'm like, and like utopian kind of, you know, like Disney World is next to Six Flags, like trying to create.
Yeah.
So like, is the infrastructure enough, or do you have to create the fantasy?
Yeah, that's so I hope I can answer this probably because that's there's a lot of there's a lot going into this. I think I kind of mentioned Peter Bogue earlier, who talks about in that article specifically, just kind of noticing they're all like Fred himself. I found just I contribute to this publication called RFD. It's like a rural. Yeah, there you go. We'll talk about that. And I found just coincidentally by going through their archive, just because I was like reading some of these old, like Fred contributed to it. So, and it's really like he had this, you know, they have this kind of romanticization of rural areas and rural queerness. And I think it also has a lot to do with Larry Mitchell with Faggots and Their Friends Between Revolutions talks about this kind of the fairies. And there's a lot of like gay men that are increasingly identifying as fairies in this time period and going to these rural areas. And so like, as far as like, I think, you know, there is a lot to do with this, you know, there's a lot of kind of cultural considerations, especially for white gay men, in this kind of traveling to rural areas. And I'm really interested in how that kind of connects metropolitan and rural areas in a really interesting way, where it's like the rural is kind of then conceptualized as a kind of outpost to blow off steam from the like metropolitan areas. And I think that's Fred's conception of this project or this resort was kind of a place to blow off steam for metropolitan gay men mostly.
Well, it's been a long couple days, so I think that's great closing place. So thank you so much to all of you for being here, and especially thank you for our amazing panelists for sharing their research for us. So thank you.
So